Hello, everyone up in McGill and online. It's really a privilege to talk about this work. I want to say right from the top, it's been done in collaboration with some great colleagues of mine, Dan Baker, Jonathan Bond, and Scott Hamshaw over the past, since 2011, 2010. So it's been a while that we've been at this important work, really looking at what can be a very invisible form of affordable housing here in the Green Mountain State. So when we think about Vermont, we often might think of images that look like these, some really idyllic rural country landscapes, thinking of our historic downtowns located here in northeastern US, not too far from Montreal and our friends up north. Oftentimes when we think about housing, mobile homes aren't the first things that come to mind. And if they do, it might be some of the pervasive social stigmas we have around this housing that first come to mind. So when we are talking with folks about their experiences living in mobile home communities, one of the things that they always want to emphasize is that we aren't trailer trash. These are really important housing opportunities for some of Vermont's low and moderate income households. And we often don't know enough about these communities or don't have them enough on our mind when we're making decisions about housing, land use, and emergency planning. Oops. There we go. There are 232 mobile home park communities across the state of Vermont. So you can see on this map, following the Route 7 corridor along 89, along 93, and then some of our pretty far-flung, more rural areas in the northeastern part of Vermont. We've seen a decline in parks over time as park owners are faced with major investments in community water infrastructure, road maintenance, and also looking at development pressures on transitioning parks to other forms of housing that might be more lucrative. So we've seen a decline in parks and the number of lots over time. So 10 years ago, there were over 260 parks when we started this work, and now we're down to 232. When we look at the number of lots, so nearly 7,100 lots in our 232 parks, a lot of our larger parks are in Chittenden County, so the part of Vermont that has a really difficult challenge with affordable housing. In a state where the median sale price of a single family home is nearly $220,000, you can buy a brand new single wide mobile home for $58,000 and have it delivered to your lot in your park, where maybe you're paying on average across the state about $350 a month for your total housing costs. This is really important when we think about folks who are on the lower income spectrum. More than 36% of all Vermonters are considered cost burdened, looking at their income relative to the housing costs. So 36% are paying 30% or more of their monthly income towards their total housing costs in a state where we've seen really stagnant incomes. Of importance to note here, 1 in 4 parks are owned by nonprofits. So those are organizations with a mission to preserve and protect affordability of these parks, or are resident-owned cooperatives. And so in those situations, you have residents that came together to buy their park and are operating it as a cooperative. And that's really been a bright star in Vermont since Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, where we've seen 13 parks face closure or being sold to a private investor-owned park, and they were able to work with a variety of partners in order to secure their own housing future. So we'll come back to that a little bit at the end. So our original work was actually working with parks around looking at issues around affecting quality of life and looking at town planning. In this work, we often found ourselves in parks like the 2 you see here, which are located pretty near to Riverside, Brookside. And so it raises this question of, are Vermont's mobile home parks actually in areas where they're likely to flood? So we fast forward to Tropical Storm Irene, where we saw 19 parks flood across the state, along with 226 mobile homes in parks. 133 of those were completely destroyed. What's really interesting to note, and so on this map, this is a map from some of our work from at that time, where we mapped out where the flooding was the worst. And so you can look at the rainfall, and then the red dots are the parks that were impacted, and the white dots are ones that were unaffected. So really the lower 2/3 of the state is where we saw 13 isolated communities completely cut off from the flooding, and then these parks down in Benton County and Brattleboro, and then many in central Vermont. What's really interesting to note from a climate justice perspective is that even though mobile homes are only 15 or 7% of the state's total housing stock, when we looked at the FEMA claims, they represented 15% of the total damaged homes being mobile homes. So that really led us to do some more on-the-ground work. I actually involved a class in working in this community that you're seeing up here on the screen. This is Westens Mobile Home Park in central Vermont, about 3 miles from the State House. Again, large park, 80 homes, all of which flooded. You can see on the image here the water line coming up nearly 1/3 of the way up on the windows. So these were taken 2 days after the storm. So mass evacuation of this park in a pretty dangerous situation, really lucky that there were no lives lost. And then people left to basically haul out all of their belongings, and you saw these piles of people's lives out in front of their homes. As they were figuring out what to do next, there were a really challenging set of circumstances because you had a park where everyone had to be evacuated, no water, no services, and folks faced with the decision of, do they scrap their mobile home, which can cost up to $8,000, or do they completely take it right back down to the studs and build and rebuild? So most folks that we worked with in this situation ended up having to have their homes removed. There was a program put in place thanks to a lot of philanthropic funding within the state that came after Irene to be able to reduce that cost to zero. But then you also saw folks who had mortgages on their homes, and so they made the decision to muck and gut, which is that photo you see in the lower corner of the slide. So folks with newer homes that were facing some pretty difficult financial decisions chose to rebuild. So what is that? Where does that leave us? So in this instance, many of these residents were staying with family members, staying in hotels, trying to make this decision about where to go. There were policymakers who were saying at the time, you know, okay, so these mobile homes are now destroyed. Like, can we move people into apartments? Can we move people elsewhere? And the first thing was, we have such a tight affordable housing supply that there were no opportunities for people to really move to. So their best option was to buy a used or buy a new mobile home and put it right back in the park that had just flooded, because they didn't really have any choice in that matter. And so when we started looking at, is this just an anecdotal story about what happened, just a fluke? And so we asked this question: are mobile home parks more vulnerable in light of what we've seen? And so with that, we put together a team to pull together E911 data, look at municipal parcel data. We knew generally where the mobile home park addresses were. Before this work, there was actually no single map of all the mobile home parks in the state, and we overlaid that with the best available data from FEMA. And so we use that data with the limitations that the type of flooding that we're more susceptible to is fluvial erosion hazard flooding, which is what we saw during Irene, where we had these really intense rain events and then leading to destabilization of riverbanks and this crashing of water. FEMA maps are based more on flood inundation, so rivers kind of rising slowly over time, and so we know these maps are flawed. In a lot of places they haven't been updated in a very long time, but it was the best available data that we had. So we made maps that look like this for every park in the state. This is a small mobile home park that actually housed elderly residents down in southern Vermont. The Whetstone Brook flows right along the edge of the property. And the red dot mobile homes were ones that were destroyed by flooding. Those lots were since closed after Irene, but the other homes that are green are all still in this very vulnerable, well within the 100-year floodplain park. And again, these are folks well into their 70s, 80s, and 90s living there. And so when we ran this analysis, looking at all the mobile home parks and comparing it to other housing here in the state, we did see that mobile home parks, or nearly 12% of them, have some proximity in a flood or location in a flood hazard area compared to regular privately owned mobile homes on private land, 6%, and single family homes, 4%. So seeing that bear out in our analysis in terms of physical vulnerability. When we looked at the social dimensions of vulnerability, we did a door-to-door survey with 360 mobile home residents across the state the fall after Irene. And so asking folks not only about their income, which you can see most folks here. Again, these are very low and moderately low income households. But we also asked, do you have a health condition or a mobility challenge that would be an issue in an emergency? 40% of folks responded yes to that. So when we were out on the ground, you'd hear a lot of people talk about, I need electricity for my oxygen, I need electricity for my medication for diabetes, that they didn't have anywhere to evacuate to easily because they didn't have transportation. So you see a lot of these layers get really complicated, not only when you're looking at the physical risk of their housing, but also looking at these social dynamics that make their situations that much more complicated. So thinking about our parks, thinking about the unique characteristics of the homes themselves, and then looking at the residents. Many of the residents older, significantly older than our median age across the state. A lot of elderly widows living on their own because it is a nice type of housing situation to downsize to. That's not an apartment. And so all of these things really functioning together to increase one's vulnerability to these more frequent and more unpredictable weather events. So rather than just focusing solely on the vulnerability, we also like to think about these communities as being particularly resilient. And so what we saw in the recovery after the storm were certainly areas and challenges that folks encountered as they were navigating their new normal. But we also saw networks and resources get activated in order to support folks who were rebuilding their lives. And so in Central Vermont, we had the Central Vermont Long-Term Recovery Committee dedicate themselves to helping every mobile home park resident get back on their feet, leveraging volunteers, donations, and really working diligently as case managers to help people put as many pieces back together as possible. This photo is of replanting a friend of ours' garden in the Westens mobile home park with my students in spring of 2012. You saw a huge really strong connections of people to their neighbors, and so people wanting to come back to their parks because they love their community. And so a lot of people were surprised about that. Most of those people were folks that had never been in a mobile home park community before and not realizing the really strong social capital that kept people together. And then finally looking at this bright spot of resident-owned cooperatives. This park, you're actually seeing one of the first parks to have actually participated in a statewide emergency catastrophic exercise or training opportunity where this cooperative actually made their own emergency response plan and then tested it during the Cat 2 exercise in 2013. And so here you have a group of residents, they bought their park facing park closure and then continuing to work together to try to make it as safe for all of their residents as possible and really being a shining star as part of that effort. So where are we now? And this is kind of where my new work will be focused, is really looking at Irene as really a focusing event, and then what's happened since. So it's almost been 10 years. What has changed for folks in these situations? And so we continue to see some park closures and lot closures, and that's a real challenge in terms of looking at a particularly unique type of housing that has a very low vacancy rate already. So about 5% of the state's parks, especially in more rural areas, are vacant. That is a real challenge if you're trying to live somewhere in Chittenden County and try to place your mobile home on a lot. You're going to have a really hard time or face a long waiting list. And so looking at the trends there and what's driving those closures. There have been changes to the hazard mitigation plan and hazard mitigation plans in terms of acknowledging that mobile homes give emergency responders unique challenges. And so now every local emergency operation plan actually has a box that asks the planners to check if they have a mobile home park community, and if so, who to contact. And then there was also inclusion and recognition of mobile home parks in the statewide hazard mitigation plan that went to FEMA this past year. I mentioned resident-owned cooperatives. Since Irene, we've seen 13 new cooperatives since 2011. Our neighboring state of New Hampshire has over 100 cooperatives, so we still have a long ways to go if we want to catch up with the Granite State. And then we've been also looking at In the conversations after Irene, a lot of folks saw an opportunity to replace this aging housing stock with perhaps a new green alternative. And so we've actually been engaged in work with Vermont, which was a private-public partnership to look at creating a green alternative to the standard mobile home. And so those have been placed as a part of a pilot initiative in parks across the state and are also available for folks to buy and purchase on their own land. So there are some challenges there, mainly with the upfront costs. We've been doing some work with residents tracking energy expenditures over a winter, and sometimes their energy bills are actually more than their lot rent. And so with the Vermont, either zero or very low expenditures if the solar is installed on it, but we're looking at about $120,000, $140,000 investment upfront compared to a $58,000 investment. So it's really challenging when you're thinking about folks who don't have that wealth to draw on to be able to make that upfront investment. And so continuing to look at that. And then finally, in this legislative session at the State House this year in Vermont, S237 is a bill that's looking at trying to raise funds to invest back in our parks as part of a whole package around affordable housing. The Tri-Park Mobile Home Cooperative down in Brattleboro, which is the senior-owned park, they're actually looking at trying to get some money to relocate 40 lots out of the floodplain in the next year. And so that'll be a story that'll be unfolding as we go, but still almost 10 years out and folks still living in harm's way. So we have a lot of work left to do on that front. So I'll end it there and look forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you.
That was it.